Good evening, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we are going to be talking about Iron Man Annual Number 11, or more specifically, the Terminus Factor, Part 2. As you can see, there's quite a bit going on as far as action goes on this cover, and also there's a familiar face alongside Iron Man, namely Machine Man. And this was a bit of strange timing because I had recently done a few reviews centering on books that Machine Man was in, and I didn't know that he was going to be, popping up in this particular annual crossover that I was going to be reviewing. So, him showing up here was a welcome surprise. And so, the main story continues from the main story in Captain America Annual 9, which contained the Terminus Factor Part 1. And the way that story left us, it was basically kind of a cliffhanger in the sense that this bear that had been possessed by this mysterious life form that seemed to be made up of energy of some sort. This bear had undergone some sort of transformation, to where it was more bloodthirsty, and things did not bode well for I get anyone coming across its path. But so that bear, at the very beginning of this issue, ends up running afoul of Machine Man and some of his friends, and the bear literally sheds its skin and reveals itself to be a newly transformed, sort of robotic monster, like an automaton, that has some of the characteristics of the bear, but it's clearly no longer anything organic. And so it attacks Machine Man and his friends, and one of his friends gets killed, and Machine Man is so badly damaged that he's his systems shut down and put him into sort of the equivalent of a medically induced coma, but for androids. And so his friend who had gotten killed was able to get him out of there by activating his flight systems, but at the cost of his life, though. And so in the meantime, though, the Machine Man ends up heading towards an area where Iron Man just happens to be having a meeting in his civilian guise as Tony Stark. And the meeting he's having is with another familiar face, a woman by the name of Sunset Bane, who also happens to secretly be the supervillain Madam Menace, who gave Machine Man a run for his money back in his original series. And so the presence of a comatose Machine Man naturally throws some confusion into the meeting, and but before things get to the point of Sunset Bane being able to covertly manipulate Machine Man or break his body down by way of revenge. Of course, while at this point Tony Stark's out of the area, this newly formed monster, this Terminus creature, ends up attacking the facility. And as it happens, this particular facility is stocked full of stuff like titanium and other heavy metals, and it's literally feeding on the metal and like devouring it like it's food. And the more it devours, the more it seems to grow. And so at this point, Tony Stark comes back to the facility after having left initially in his Iron Man guise. And bear in mind that at this point in time, most of the public, was under the impression that Iron Man was in fact Tony Stark's bodyguard. They were unaware that the two of them were one and the same. And so Sunset Bane and her people think that Tony Stark's still wandering around her facility, and hence, why when they call him, they don't know that, he's actually flying, away as Iron Man. But anyway, he comes back to the facility and, engages this, Terminus monster in battle, and he seems to be, hopelessly outmatched. But it was shortly, into the fight that Machine Man comes back online, and even though he's badly damaged still, he's able to assist Iron Man in shutting, this thing down, so to speak. And they find out that, whereas, I guess you could say, infantile form of this monster was vulnerable to cold, as shown in Part 1 in Captain America Annual 9. This particular form of the monster, this, further along as far as, growth and development goes, is actually vulnerable to extreme forms of heat. And so, since they happen to be in a foundry area of Sunset Bane's facilities, they end up using molten metal or liquid metal, to defeat the monster. And something along the lines of Alien 3 or Terminator 2, that liquid metal or that molten steel or titanium or whatever it was that they ended up using in the facility, that's what ends up doing the trick on the monster. Whereas none of Iron Man's weapons were destroying it, and Machine Man's tactics were somewhat limited in the sense that he was still recovering from having been damaged in the fight beforehand. And so anyway, they defeat this particular monster, and Iron Man seems to be experiencing some form of telepathic connection with it to some extent, and the name of Terminus is popping up in his head. And since he had actually been possessed by the infantile life form, or the infantile version of this life form back in Part 1, I guess that's where the telepathic connection seems to still be present in that sense. And so he's kind of confused because Terminus is actually a cosmic threat level villain that people like say Quasar, the Fantastic Four, were more accustomed to going up against rather than him. And so he's trying to figure out, okay, what's this thing doing here, and why am I the one that has its attention? And so anyway, though, he's got questions, and so does Machine Man, but at the same time they realize that things might not be settling down as they think, because it turns out that a lot of animals are being reported by the news as not only coming their way, but also having been newly transformed into these sort of mechanical automatons akin to the bear creature that they had just defeated. And so they naturally realized that there's still more work to be done, and this terror is not yet ended. And so this was actually a pretty cool story, because okay, so first off, the creative team was made up of the writers Roy and Dan Thomas, who are the same gentlemen who wrote part 1 of the Terminus Factor over in Captain America Annual 9. And so you definitely have a form of consistency in terms of, getting from, narratively speaking, getting from point A to point B. And so, there's a good sense of continuity, in between, part 1 and part 2. And as well as good character development, and Iron Man's still a little bit shaken about what happened in part 1 because he was possessed, but he's also trying to adjust and do what heroes do, in at least in this setting. It's like you learn from your experience, and you survive and you adapt. And so this was actually a pretty cool portrayal of Tony Stark, because this was kind of how I grew up reading about Tony Stark. He had the alter ego of Iron Man, but everyone thought that the two of them were two separate people. And unlike the classic Robert Downey Jr. movie, he hadn't yet told the world, I am Iron Man. And so it was fascinating seeing him operate as Tony Stark in the business sense, but then to go from that to finding a way to fake, say, taking a stroll and then becoming Iron Man. I thought that was pretty cool, and it was kind of a nice reminder of how I initially grew up reading about Iron Man. I also like the fact that they brought in the character of Machine Man, because other than Machine Man 2020, the 4-issue miniseries that was done in the 80s, he hadn't really had much focus in between that miniseries and his appearance here. He had a few supporting appearances, like where I guess he'd be in the background or something, in, like, say, the Avengers, or or other comics like that. But there are a lot of callbacks and references to some of his stories, including that miniseries. But there was also a bit of a wrinkle thrown into his plot development, because having read the miniseries, which was written before this story was made, there are some events that happened in that miniseries, or at least that were said to have happened, and you kind of see how they transpired in this issue. Like the friend of his who ends up getting killed. You see how that actually, it was talked about in the miniseries, but then you actually see how it happens here. And so that was I feel strange saying neat, but in the sense that this was a character that had been with Machine Man from the beginning, and so it was cool to see him again, as well as a certain other character who would go on to be a staunch ally of his. But it was cool to see these characters again, but it was kind of sad that the one who ended up dying, that this was more or less his last appearance, as far as I know, in Machine Man's story. But at the same time, it was also fascinating, seeing the character Sunset Bane, brought back into the fold, because even though she and Machine Man, they're both enemies, even though they're in the same story, they never have face-to-face interaction. Or Sunset Bane, she actually does speak to him face-to-face, but but it's either when he's unconscious, or when she's in her civilian disguise and he doesn't yet know that, Sunset Bane and Madame Menace are one and the same. And so, it was fascinating, seeing that little, dynamic there. But there was also something else, because, a lot of events have transpired in between, the 80s miniseries and this story, both in the Marvel Universe and, I guess, within Machine Man's life. But some of the stuff, some of the dialogue, it talks about events that sound familiar, but at the same time, though, they are clearly transpiring differently from how they were supposed to have transpired, as described in the miniseries back from the 80s. And so this apparently is kind of an implication that there are two different timelines. There's the timeline that led from Machine Man, from his original series to his quote unquote final adventure in the year 2020. But then there's also the timeline in which this transpires. And so there are similarities, but there are also differences, which also seem to imply that, there are two different versions of Machine Man floating around, or at least there were when the story was taking place. So, I thought that was, kind of, interesting, because, the guys who put the story together, they clearly had a fondness for the character. And I appreciated how, they furthered, the Terminus Factor story, with the focus on Iron Man, but they also found a way to, bring in, the surprise edition of, a C-list character of Machine Man, and also enhance his story. And so, also, the action scenes, as illustrated by, Tom Morgan and Randy Emberlin, the action scenes, were very well done. Whether it be, the Terminus monster gradually increasing in size, throughout its appearances in the story, while causing untold destruction, or whenever it be Iron Man, disposing of the monster in a rather explosive manner. The action scenes are very exciting, and also you feel the tension of the situation, and so and as well as the panic of the people on the ground as well. And so I thought that this was a case of the artwork working in tandem with the writing to give us a chaotic battle situation. And this was it was a good second chapter for the Terminus Factor, and you see just how ominous this threat is becoming. And so I'm going to go ahead and give if the Termini Come 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good second part to this storyline, and I definitely want to see how part 3 goes. And so now we get to the standalone stories that take up the rest of the annual. Second up on the list is something called Media Watch, written by Evan Skolnick and illustrated by Richard Howell and David Day. And basically, this Media Watch story, it consists of news reports, covering the events transpiring from the Terminus Factor thus far. There's a bit of a recap regarding the the interactions with the superheroes who have gone up against this threat so far. Namely, it recaps the events from Part 1 in Captain America Annual 9, as well as the events in this issue in the main story. But also, you see sort of eyewitnesses on the ground, and they're describing what's happening to the wildlife in the area, and how they're gradually becoming transformed and seem to be sort of this monstrous mechanical army. And you get something that it sounds I mean, it really does look like I guess how a news report would a live news report would be carried out in the Marvel universe if it were, say, real life, so to speak. And so it's a brief it's a short little story. It's only a couple of pages, but I like that touch though, and because it further draws you into the overall Terminus factor story. And so, I mean, you kind of get the idea that the heroes are going to save the day eventually. I mean, because this was in 1990. Lots happened since in between 1990 and now. But at the same time, though, I appreciated the effort that they made in order to make the main story feel a lot more urgent to the reader. And so, as short of the story as it was efficient in expanding on what's been going on so far in the main stories. And so I'm going to go ahead and give a Media Watch 4 out of 5 stars. A short story, but it does its job well. And so, okay, this is where we get to the third story called Mobility, also written by Evan Skolnick, the same guy who wrote Media Watch. But also the art team consists of Gavin Curtis and Harry Cuddleton. I think it's how you say his name. But anyway, though, this is a very odd story because it focuses on a I guess you could say a civil rights group consisting of individuals who have been confined to wheelchairs, and so they're protesting by basically chaining themselves to a certain set of buses from a company that's refused to make wheelchair accessible accommodations for those confined to wheelchairs. And Iron Man gets involved because Tony Stark's been watching the group in the news, and basically things happen to where people are, their tensions rising between this group and the public outside of the group, because by chaining themselves to the buses, they're preventing certain people from taking those buses when they rely on those buses to get from point A to point B. And so Iron Man gets involved to sort of de-escalate the tension, but then things happen, like there's a mechanical failure and one of the buses goes out of control, and Iron Man has to save the leader of the civil rights group from falling off a bridge along with the bus because he's chained to the bus. Excuse me, sorry. Anyway, though, I thought this was an odd story because it's one of those stories that it's definitely a standalone story, and I guess in my opinion, it's not that memorable, but it also felt kind of odd, and for the type of story it was and the inclusion within this book, or this issue, I guess, because it doesn't really have any semblance of a connection with the story, the main story of this issue. And I mean, I guess I wouldn't have had a problem with that, but unlike, say, a soldier story from Captain America Annual 9, which was also a standalone issue, that not a standalone issue, but a standalone story that had no connection to the main story of that issue. It managed to actually feel like something that would happen within the life and times of Captain America. Whereas this story, though, I mean, I guess, I mean, yeah, it at the time, for the time, I mean, it was trying to have a message, or a reminder that people who are confined to wheelchairs, they need, they deserve access to buses and buildings too, and basically that, I guess they were trying to serve a reminder to not only the readers but maybe to businesses too. I'm not sure, but and one of the problems I have with the story is, I mean, this might have been just because I mean, this was written when I was a kid, and so I wasn't really on the up and up on what was going on in the world at the time, as far as civil rights groups, specifically groups for those in wheelchairs. And so I don't know if the discrimination was really as bad as this story was making it out to be. I mean, I do understand that there is sort of an issue of people not having access to buildings or vehicles due to them being confined to wheelchairs. I understand that that can make things difficult, but the way that this story was describing it, it made it sound like the public had a vendetta against people in wheelchairs. And maybe I need to do some more research on something like that, but I honestly don't remember stuff like that happening. So maybe I don't know, maybe I just missed it. But reading it now in 2021, it just feels like the people who came up with the story, I mean, they maybe they initially had a good goal in a sense of trying to draw attention to the plight of a group, but at the same time, though, I think that they made it more dramatic than the plight really was. And so, I mean, when you're basically chaining yourself to a bus, that's something you'd expect from, say, racial discrimination, or protesting, say, a verdict that is say on immoral or something like that. But it just felt more over dramatic to me, at least. And I mean, I don't know if stuff like this actually happened with groups that advocated for people in wheelchairs. I don't know if it was really that bad, but reading it from today's standards, or by from the standpoint of today, in which most buildings and vehicles, like, say, buses or what have you, actually do try and make a point to be wheelchair compatible. It just felt kind of over the top, as it were. So story wise, it just had me kind of scratching my head at times. metaphorically speaking, but I will say that the artwork was actually pretty good. The artwork, in some ways, it almost reminded me of the realism of, say, someone like David Lloyd, the guy who worked with Alan Moore on V for Vendetta. So the artwork was really good, but it's just, other than that though, the story, didn't really have anything to, recommend it, at least in my opinion. So it wasn't a terrible story, but just felt kind of out of place, to me anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and give Mobility, 2 out of 5 stars. I mean, it was okay. At least it looked good, due to the artwork. So the fourth story, this was a fun one. It's called The Awesome Origin of Miss Arbogast, and the writer was Carrie Barre, or it might have been Carrie Barre. It's Barre, Bear or Bar. And then the artwork was by the late great Steve Ditko. And I realized in my previous reviews of the Machine Man complete collection, which contained the work by Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko on the series, I realized that I was very critical of Steve Ditko's artwork on that particular series. And so, when I found out that he was, working on a story that was in this annual, which featured the character of Machine Man, whom he had worked on several years, before this story was put out, I was, in some respects, I was really excited because, hey, Steve Ditko, the guy who, co-created Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and, is really good at, doing, surreal landscapes and things like that. But at the same time, though, I was remembering, the fact that the last time I read something that was illustrated by him, which was, the work he did on Machine Man, it was not that good. And so I was kind of conflicted about, okay, how's this going to go? But thankfully, though, this was a story that it was a fun read, and it was a story that actually I think was tailored to fit Steve Ditko's strengths as an artist, because Ditko is a guy who I think might have peaked in between the 60s and 70s art-wise, but so what they ended up doing though in the story was they had it set within that time frame. I think it might have been between the 60s and 70s, and so as a result, since the story is set in around that time, it actually looks like something, stylistically speaking, that would have been illustrated from that time. And so having a flashback story actually made things a lot more believable, and I think it freed Steve Ditko up from some of the obstacles that he might have had in, say, trying to do a story taking place in the then modern day of 1990. And so this story, though, like the title suggests, it centers on Miss Arbogast, who many readers of Iron Man will remember as the secretary of Tony Stark. And she's very loyal, very dependable, and a very lovable character. And in this story, though, you see how she came to work for Tony Stark, and it's sort of it's almost like a comedy of errors type story, though. I mean, but I liked how you saw how she was she was in competition with other applicants, and all of the applicants were younger and more attractive than her, but she ends up actually having more skill as a secretary, doing clerical work and things like that. But as it happens, though, Tony Stark, he's running late, but she's told to make her himself at home in his office, and he'll be in there shortly. But in the meantime, though, Iron Man is fighting a costumed villain right outside the building. And so, at this point in time, much like in the then president of 1990, the world at large, they believed that Iron Man was the bodyguard of Tony Stark. And so it made sense that, he would be near Tony Stark's property if someone was attacking it. But anyway, this villain, though, ends up putting up more of a fight than Iron Man expected. And so, they both end up trashing Tony Stark's office, while Mrs. Arbogast is, on one hand, she's, stunned that she's being able to witness, a fight like this up close, but she's also, her clerical, instincts are kicking in, and she's, trying to, gather up all the papers that are flying around, due to, all the, chaos and, explosions, that are resulting from the fight. And so, everything's, flying around, and she's, doing her best to, gather it all together, keep, certain documents from being destroyed. And then, she ends up improvising with a telephone call. Namely, a client of Tony Stark's was calling right at that moment. And so she picks up the phone and, completely in character as a secretary, answers it and, seriously takes a message. But then she ends up improvising by, telling the villain that Iron Man's fighting that, hey, the call's for him. And so the villain's like, wait a minute, what? And when he goes to answer the phone, due to being, flat out confused, that's when Iron Man's able to, basically get the drop on him and defeat him finally. And it's with that, act of improvisation, with that, that's when she gets into Tony Stark's good graces. And so, when Tony Stark, comes, into the office later as himself, he tells her, hey, you had one heck of a reference from my bodyguard, Iron Man. So, you don't even need to do the interview. You're in. And so, I liked the story. It was fun. I mean, it was a nice little blast from the past, because of when it was set. But it was also, really cool to see Miss Arbogast, really, I guess, do, pass, her, trial by fire, with flying colors. And, I love the fact that she literally defeated the supervillain, with the phone call that she was, working on. But so yeah, that was a fun story, and it kind of made me, it made me think of one of the secretaries or receptionists at work, and so it's like, yeah, it kind of reminded me of her. So I'll definitely have to tell her about it later, tomorrow or something. I'm sure she'll get a kick out of it. But that story, I'm gonna go ahead and give it 4 out of 5 stars. It was fun, and unlike the story before it, Mobility, it actually felt like something that would take place in the life and times of Iron Man. And so, that was a standalone story that made more sense, to have in this issue, and so I appreciated that about it. And so last up is basically, actually no, there were two more stories, not just one, but the fifth story is called The Devil's Playground, and it was written and illustrated by a gentleman named Rob Tokar, I think I say his name. But anyway, he gives us a story that, and once again, standalone story, not tied to, the main story driving this issue, but it is somewhat interesting because it focuses on this little kid who has, an overactive imagination, and he and his friends apparently like to, play as, some of the heroes in the Marvel universe. One of the kids likes to play as Captain America, while he likes to play as Iron Man. And so basically he's having to deal with the fact that as much as he wants to keep on playing as a superhero, not all of his friends are able to accommodate him all the time, because they have their parents, they have their lives. And so it keeps cutting in between, I guess you could say, his perception of real life, crossed with his perception of his imaginary adventures. And I'm not sure, I mean, it wasn't a bad story, and I mean, there were some cute moments, and obviously having been a kid a long time ago, and I loving comic books as much as I did then, still do now. There were some nice little moments where it made me think back to when I was a kid, and being in an imaginary world, and trying to fight crime, wanting to get friends together, but not always able to do so. I mean, it kind of brought back some memories, and it kind of it sort of pulled at the heartstrings of nostalgia just a little bit. But at the same time, though, I guess, I mean, it was a cute story, but I guess it felt like something that, if it was going to be included in this book, I mean, I felt like there could have been a way to maybe I guess, I don't know. It just, the way it ended, I mean, it was funny, but at the same time, it just felt like something that, I mean, it could have been a story that, was predominantly comical, but, there could have been sort of a real world reminder about, hey, we all got to grow up at some point, or something like that. Or, I don't know, maybe I'm just used to, reading stories like that nowadays. But, I mean, it was a fun little story. But at the same time, it's not necessarily something that, is going to really stand out. I mean, I will say I like the artwork, because it really, captured, I guess, the energy of youth, if you will. It was very energetic, and I liked how, it went from, how the real world looked, and then how this kid's, imagination looked, and all that. But I also liked how, his parents, they were just kind of like, okay, he's at it again, but hey, he's our kid, we love him, that kind of thing. I mean, so I like the little, family, dynamic and all that. And so, I'm gonna go ahead and give the story, 3 out of 5 stars. I mean, it was nice. It was cute, but not necessarily something, that, stands out as a good bit of storytelling, I guess. It could have, I think it would have been better if it had, ended in a more, maybe if his parents had a sit down with him to, just, explain to him about, how real life works, or something like that. I mean, that would have been an interesting perspective, considering that, the Marvel universe, within that universe, is real life, and so, trying to have a conversation like in real life as, we live it, with a kid, say, with an overactive imagination. I mean, that's, a conversation in and of itself, but trying to have that conversation with, a kid in the Marvel universe, see, that would have actually made, for a good story. Like, if it had been, say, humorous and comical up until that point. I mean, not to where it'd be like a downer or anything, but just one of those, oh, okay, kid gets a light bulb moment. That would have been a better way to end the story. But as it was just cute and comical, but, you're not going to really go away, thinking about it, seriously after reading it. So, okay, last story. It's called Correspondences, and it was written by Dwayne McDuffie. Notice I say written, not illustrated, because other than pictures of faxes and letters, from from one party going to another, there's no illustration. But Dwayne McDuffie, though, he's written and done a lot of work on kids shows like Static Shock or Justice League Unlimited, and so to see him working on a Marvel story from 1990, that was a surprise, and it just reminded me of how good of a writer he was, and it was too bad that he passed when he did, because the world lost a fine comic book writer. Anyway, so Correspondences, though, it's one of those stories that you literally have to read, because it consists of faxes going back and forth between parties, and so you gradually put together that there's all sorts of shenanigans, and there was a mix up, and basically there's this group called Damage Control, which is a repair group, a construction group that is specifically made up of people who go around repairing the damage that results from battles between superheroes and supervillains. And I never read the actual Damage Control series when it came out, but I do know that it was well received and regarded as a good example of a humorous series, apparently. So anyway, the letters are between Damage Control and Tony Stark, and as well as Iron Man, and basically in the midst of clearing up the damage from a fight between Iron Man and someone else a while back, they end up coming across there's like all sorts of mix-ups, and basically there's a package that ends up they end up getting a hold of a package that was supposed to go to Iron Man or Tony Stark, but unfortunately there's a problem with it. It's apparently been activated, and there's like a destruct mechanism that's about to basically level a city block, more or less. And so and you're seeing this all in Correspondences, and so it goes from cold and professional to suddenly Iron Man literally writing in all caps, don't mess with this, put it down, don't touch anything else, I'm on my way over, I'm literally flying over. And so you basically you're through reading these Correspondences, you're basically seeing how Iron Man's literally having to basically drop what he's doing, go all the way back to where Damage Control is, and deal with this. And I mean, it's one of those things that the way I'm saying it, it's probably not that amusing, but if you read it though, I mean, and you're finding out what's going on, it's actually a surprisingly funny little story. And I do like how at the very end, Tony Stark basically patches things up with Damage Control by way of yet another bit of correspondence, and both sides part on good terms. And so I liked how it showed how Tony Stark was actually a pretty good business leader through these Correspondences, as well as an overall good guy. And it was kind of a glimpse into his personality just through reading the letters and stuff. So I liked it. It was a pleasant surprise. So I'm going to go ahead and give Correspondences 4 out of 5 stars. I mean, it was another short story, but it was good. It was a nice little read, and it was surprisingly funny. But it also did a good job of giving a little bit of insight into the character of Tony Stark, as well as the group of damage control. But anyway, yeah. So that was my take on Iron Man Annual 11. And the main focus of it was obviously Terminus Factor Part 2. And so but I liked I did enjoy the main story, but mobility aside, the standalone stories were enjoyable as well. So I'm looking forward to reading the Terminus Factor Part 3, which is actually in Thor Annual, and so that's going to be interesting, going up to read that. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to check this out, and hope you all enjoyed my review on it. Y'all got any questions, comments, let me know. Y'all have a good night. Bye.